So obviously when I loaded the new update, first thing I did was hop in this bad boy and try to fly it, which is not an easy task. The VTOL mode is interesting. First of all, in Sim you have a lot to compensate for. It's very unstable, but fortunately they have stability assist, and honestly that makes it a lot easier. I was trying to learn it without that at first, and though it is technically possible, it makes things really complicated in your mind when you're trying to manage your aircraft and the way it's behaving, plus your VTOL system, in order to actually take off efficiently. On that topic, I'm going to go to 100% VTOL mode real quick and walk you through the way I have found that I have the best luck doing this. A lot of people will fly it like a helicopter where they'll take off and then they'll nose down. The issue is if you then start transitioning into forward flight mode, you're nosing down. It's a problem. So a lot of people will balloon really high, nose down, go straight out of VTOL mode, and then nearly crash and pull up just at the last moment. I like to do things pretty much exactly the opposite. First of all, when you're taking off from a carrier, if you start at around 85 to 90%, you're going to hover over the carrier, which is going to make things a little bit easier for you in terms of visualizing what you're doing. Otherwise, you'll just be left in the dust by the carrier, which has its own speed. It's currently going around 50 kilometers an hour, as you can see at the top left. So if you start there, and you give it a little bit of thrust just to get off the ground, what I like to do is keep my nose perfectly stable, and then use my thrust vectoring to control my forward momentum. I'll try to keep my nose a little bit up in the air so that I continue to maintain lift, but then I will try not to balloon by giving myself more and more thrust vectoring so that my engines are not directly below me, pushing me up and ballooning me. And then as you get closer and closer, you can start pitching up a little bit more as you start getting to less of a helicopter mode and more of a stalling aircraft mode. Now that I'm at around 500, I'm going to bring up my gear before I forget. That's a bit tricky. And push it all the way into forward flight mode. And now, as you can see, I've never really gained altitude at an extreme rate, and I have fairly easily transitioned into forward flight mode. It's kind of pointless to do that off a carrier since you have the catapult, but it was fun to experiment with. Some other things to consider are flaps. Everything is more complicated in this aircraft because you can't just think about what it's going to do to your stalling aircraft, but what it's also going to do to you when you're strictly in VTOL mode. What I have done is I have taken off stability assist and experimented with the flaps. I'll put my air brake out so I can put them out here and show you, because I wanted to see if they were in front of or behind the center of mass. Essentially, when I deploy them, if they were going to nose down or nose up. It's not really an issue because your dampening will take care of that for you, but it is something that could potentially limit you if your damping gets maxed out, if it's trying to go full nose down to compensate for the fact that you have flaps out and you don't even realize it because you're not putting in any inputs. So while I was experimenting with it, I was just trying to keep my nose as stable as possible and then put flaps out, and as you can see, it's slight nose up, but nothing extreme. So they are technically usable, but then that's another thing you have to put in your mental checkbox when you're actually taking off. You have to remember to put your flaps back in. And they don't necessarily help a ton when you're strictly in VTOL mode. So personally, I haven't really been using them, and I've just used my thrust vectoring as my flaps, essentially. Not because they don't work, and not because they aren't useful in like transitioning speeds like that, but just because it's a complication, and I'm already struggling with the information overload trying to fly this thing. Now, if you want to go for a VTOL landing, I do things a little bit differently. I do not gently transition. I put my plane directly into VTOL mode with 0% throttle, and then I attempt to stall it out. This is a situation where flaps can be useful if you want, but essentially once I feel myself starting to fall out of the sky and my altitude start to drop, I add some thrust to compensate, and I pull up a little bit harder on the stick so that I can slow down in a similar fashion to a helicopter. I can point my engines forward a little bit. The hard part is that eventually you'll stall pretty hard, and jet engines take a while to spool up, so you'll want to go into 100% a little bit early. But then, if you do it right, you should be able to come to a halt pretty easily and pretty efficiently. No flaps required. I did have my air brake on during that. I forgot about that. I will normally turn my air brake on to slow down quicker. I just forgot to take it off after doing this last time. Now, as you can see, I'm basically flying backwards because of what I was doing there, because I had my nose up. So now I'm having to compensate for that. If you drop your nose a little bit early, you won't have to. It's just the sake of remembering a lot of things at once that makes this challenging to fly. Once you are in a pretty decent hover like this, you have to consider that if you have ordnance, you will overheat your engine trying to stay afloat. And if you have a ton of ordnance, you might actually sink. Proper VTOL like this is something that I was not able to do with certain loadouts. You can still fly slow if you're looking to hit ground targets, but you need to keep a little bit of forward momentum, and honestly flaps might be a good idea to get that transitional lift. I'm not really entirely sure how well transitional lift works in general. If I were to, say, drop to 80% and get a little bit of forward momentum here, and then decrease my throttle just a bit, I know if I keep my nose down, it's going to work against me. The air is going to hit the top of my aircraft and push me into the ground. But the theory is that if I bring my nose up a little bit, my engines will be able to compensate for it with their new angle, and I should be able to fly forward at a reduced throttle setting. So if you do have a ton of weight underneath your aircraft, this is probably the closest you're going to get to true VTOL. And you can just fly it like a very responsive biplane, essentially, at 200 kilometers an hour, just without the same level of maneuverability. And as you can see, when I'm in this mode, I have a targeting computer, which doesn't work too well on water, but I can kind of show you how, say I was going after some ground targets, this could be an effective flying mode. Downside being, as you can see, I'm putting my nose down, and then the moment I do that, transitional lift works against me. And this isn't like a helicopter. I don't have as much immediate power. I am relying on that transitional lift to maintain my altitude, especially if I have more ordnance. If I was in the British version there with a few SRAMs and some 1,000-pounders, I don't even know if I could have done that. Nosing down like that to get guns on target may have been a death sentence. It's not an easy plane to fly. I think that the physics behind it are fairly simple and easy to understand, but by the time you get all of those keybinds and all of those controls working together and you're trying to think it through, you really have to have a plan in your mind before you do anything. Otherwise, you're just going to end up crashing because you just don't have immediate control over your thrust vectoring. At least if you have as complicated of a control setup as I do. I'm basically holding a button on my mouse and then using my hat switch on my joystick to control that, because I'm so low on control options in general when playing sim. And then the thrust from your main engine, it's a jet engine, so it's not immediate. It's not as fast and as responsive as a helicopter rotor. And then when you're relying on transitional lift just to maintain altitude, you have less power there in general. And then in post here, a couple of things I forgot. You guys have seen the engine overheating. It's really bad, and that applies to level flight as well. And if you're going to use the catapult, which is the better option, taking off from a carrier, make sure you put your cockpit down before, and then make sure you are immediately ready to raise your gear, otherwise you will snap it. So after flying it, obviously the big question is it worth actually using? And I'm thinking about this in the context of Sim EC. The VTOL can theoretically come in handy. There are carriers on some maps, and whether it's the old World War II ones or the new modern ones, it is more efficient technically to land there. I believe you can rearm faster. Don't quote me on that, I've just heard it from word of mouth. And then if it's the World War II ones, you get an air spawn. So that's a lot faster than taking off. And even if it is the modern ones and they've all been replaced, the catapult system is still fantastic. So you might be able to get down and get back into the air faster than you would in a different aircraft. But beyond that, unless you want to do something funny and hide behind a mountain and poke out and launch an air-to-air missile, it's not that practical. There are theoretically the convoy hitting targets that occasionally pop up as objectives, and you could theoretically do that in one easy pass with a ballistic computer in VTOL mode. But that's going to show you killing targets in the kill feed, and people are going to be able to deduce where you are, and then you have no defensive capabilities in VTOL mode. You're kind of boned. So when I was looking at this, the real question is, does it work as a 9.7 attacker? Because the ordnance, or sorry, the VTOL isn't really in and of itself a good enough feature to justify using it. And the answer to that is kinda no, at least for the US tech tree variant. You do get Mighty Mouses, which are excellent for farming, but not a lot of them. The bomb loadout is pretty mediocre. You can take a couple of 1,000-pounders and a 500, or 3 500s, which is okay, but not as good as like a B-57 at a lower battle rating. 9Gs are nice, so as a fighter you do have good missiles, but you're at the same battle rating as a F-100, and I would personally rather take the performance of the F-100 and deal with 9Es than take a slightly better missile in the performance of the Harrier. But looking at some other things, you can look at the premiums and then consider the fact that they are premiums. You get the additional rewards, and now suddenly the Mighty Mouse rocket loadout seems a little bit better for lion gain. But I would say this one's really in a similar boat. The place where I actually start to see justification for using Harriers is the British tech tree. The standard one is okay, but nothing fantastic. But when you look at the premium one, you get two benefits. You get SRAMs, which are broken as shit and are amazing. And you get this loadout here with 6 or 108 total rockets, which if you take into factor, or if you take into consideration your premium bonus, basically just double that for your lion gain. And now you're shooting 216 per run, which is not that far off from something like a Phantom, which shoots around 300 per run, 285. So it's actually a decent grinding vehicle. If you guys didn't watch my last video, getting lions in Sim is ridiculously hard now. And one of the best ways to do it is to cheese the system, because rocket impacts count as their own score bonus. So when you have a shit ton of rockets, you can actually get quite big score bonuses. And using this, you could get similar performance to a Phantom in the US tree in terms of lion farming. I'm going to cut in here. I'm editing the video right now, and I just want to say, double check this yourself before you actually buy something based off of this. This is most likely a bug and will most likely be fixed, so do not buy it purely off of this without doing your own research first. I haven't tested it since the new patch. With that said, I am going to cut to a quick clip of me demonstrating why SRAMs are so good in Sim. If I was using AIM 90s in an F-100, which is a similar battle rating, what I would usually have to do, because I didn't have radar, was buzz the target to confirm that it's hostile, and then gain altitude. I would try to be supersonic while doing this, and go for a top-down approach on the target, which at that point usually knows I'm there because I had to get that close. With the SRAMs, and this is a little bit riskier, you can basically launch at identifying ranges, because they have such insane maneuverability, the missiles, that the only limiting factor is that you have to be slightly behind the target in order to actually get the lock. But then once you do, even if you're incredibly close, you can still get off the rails and get an easy hit. They're honestly pretty damn broken. I'll show you here. As you can see, it just takes off at an angle and kills the guy. With a 9E, that never would have been possible. It would have been possible if I pulled hard Gs and got behind him like that, and then launched it with a high angle of attack so it could guide to target. But that is much more challenging to do. It bleeds a ton of speed, and in the end you still might be too close for that thing to be able to track as a 10G missile. So the SRAMs actually make it a capable fighter in Sim. And so with these discoveries, I don't even think I'm going to buy the US version, at least until I have an abundance of lions, which will probably be never because of the way Sim works. I'm probably going to spend the money that I was using to save up to purchase it on, I don't know, probably Russian or German aircraft, and working towards another tree. And if I ever do decide that I want to finish up the Brits and actually get some Tier 5, Tier 6 aircraft, this will probably be a great option. This is a demonstration of the ballistic computer on rocket mode, and how you can use that to strafe airfields quite well. Obviously not the best demonstration given my angle that I was approaching this. I'd be dead by AA, but you get the idea. Anyway, if you guys are thinking about buying it, like I said, I'd probably recommend this one the most out of any of them, and I will see you guys in the next video.